Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for July 10th of 2023. And currently we have 5 main regions of severe weather development for today. We have a very large area to cover, so today might be a longer forecast than usual. We do have an enhanced risk region for northwestern Kansas and southern Nebraska, as well as a slight risk that extends into the Michigan Peninsula thing across central Wisconsin and southern Minnesota, all the way into western Texas and the Texas Panhandle across western Oklahoma, and then pretty large marginal threat around that extends all the way into the Gulf Coast region and Florida. And then for central Montana, we do have a marginal threat there, as well as a marginal threat for the New England region for southern Vermont and New Hampshire and Connecticut and the majority of Rhode Island and Massachusetts right here. We do have 5 main regions of severe weather development for today. We have this region here, this region here, this region here, this region here, and this region here. These are all going to be separate from each other, so we have tons of area to cover today. As for our threats, we do have a 2% tornado threat for that area in Wisconsin and southern Minnesota. I will get into that in today's forecast, and I will likely touch on every location here in today's forecast because I will be looking at the entire United States for today's models and not specific locations because it's such a large area. So I'll likely be able to cover every single region in today's forecast. As for our wind threat, we do have a 30% for that enhanced risk region with a hatch significant for that enhanced risk region as well. And then every region does have at least a 5% wind threat, and the Wisconsin region does have a 15% wind threat. And then as for hail, every region except for the New England region and the Gulf Coast region has a hail threat. However, the central Nebraska region into parts of Kansas and Colorado and parts of South Dakota and Iowa do have a hatch significant 15% hail threat. It is likely going to stay mostly in Nebraska. However, it does look a little bit larger because it is going outside of Nebraska, which kind of makes it look larger. However, it will likely just stay in Nebraska for now. And then we do have a 15% hail threat for that slight risk region in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then a 5% hail threat for that region in central Montana. Taking a look at our pivotal weather model, starting off with our 500 millibars like we usually do, we have a pretty textbook meridional flow jet stream. You can see that it is pretty prominent here. We do have a low pressure system across the Ohio Valley and a high pressure system in the southwest, which is pushing the jet stream into a pretty textbook meridional flow pattern here, as well as a somewhat prominent shortwave trough that is coming out of Canada and dipping down, which will be the main trigger for severe weather development in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin region. However, for everywhere else except for the New England region, this meridional flow pattern here is going to be the main trigger for severe weather development in Montana, the Central Plains, and the Gulf Coast region. And then as for the triggers for that marginal threat in the New England region, you can see that we do have a very small low pressure system that is expected to develop over New York with a embedded shortwave trough that is expected to move across the region in particular and trigger that marginal threat for today. As for the meridional flow pattern and everywhere that is affected by it, it is much more of a zonal flow pattern, so weak directional shear isn't likely going to be present with anywhere that's being affected by the meridional flow pattern. However, where that 2% tornado threat region is, that very strong shortwave trough coming out of Canada, it isn't too much of a prominent trough. However, it is definitely going to be sufficient enough for some weak directional shear and the possibility of just barely sufficient enough for that 2% tornado threat with directional shear. So that's going to be our main triggers for severe weather development for today. Taking a look at our dew points, starting off with the enhanced risk region in the Central Plains, you can see that we do have some fairly strong dew points. We have dew points that are likely going to be in the upper 60s and the low 70s, and with whatever lapse rates we see, we could definitely see the possibility of some pretty strong instability here, at least in the 3000s and possibly the upper 2000s, at least with weak lapse rates. And then down along the Gulf Coast, you can see we have some fairly strong dew points. We do have dew points that are in the upper 70s and possibly the low 80s in the Gulf region. We aren't expecting any on-land development, maybe in the Florida Panhandle. It is likely that storms are going to develop in the Gulf with a stronger humidity in the 8s and the upper 7s, and then move on land and trigger that marginal threat on land. So some fairly strong dew points are definitely in place, and with whatever lapse rates we have, we could definitely see some pretty strong instability as well. the possibility of Cape values that do reach the 3000s, at least in the low 3000s. And then back towards the marginal threat along the meridional flow in the Montana region, you can see we do have overall much more moderate dew points in the 50s, in the mid 50s, possibly the upper 50s in some regions. As you can see, some low 60s here. However, it's likely just going to be in the upper 50s to mid 50s. With whatever lapse rates we have, we could definitely see much more moderate instability in the 1000s to 2000s range. And then for that slight risk region that is back towards the Wisconsin and southern Minnesota region, you can see we do have some fairly strong dew points in the mid to upper 60s. Definitely see the possibility of some pretty strong instability as well with Cape values that do reach the possibility of the upper moderates in the 2500 range, depending on our lapse rates. And then back towards the New England region, we have dew points that are in the 60s and the upper 60s and possibly the low 70s. With whatever lapse rates we have, we could definitely see the possibility of Cape values that do reach the upper moderates and possibly the 2500 range and maybe even the low 3000s. Taking a look at our lapse rates, starting off with an enhanced risk region in the Central Plains, you can see that we do have some fairly strong lapse rates. We have lapse rates that are in the mid to upper 8s and possibly the low 9s in some regions, but further down south. However, this is going to allow for the possibility of some extremely strong instability that could likely reach the low 4000s and possibly the upper to mid 3000s. And then back towards the Gulf Coast region, we do have some fairly overall weak lapse rates that aren't really getting up into the 8s at all. That's going to significantly decrease our instability a ton, leading to Cape values that are likely going to be in the more of the low 3000s and possibly the 2500 range, maybe the mid 3000s with those upper 70s and those low 80s. We definitely see the possibility of overall weaker instability compared to if we had strong lapse rates. However, with the extremely strong dew points to make up for that, we definitely see the possibility of Cape values that do reach the mid 3000s in the Gulf region. And then back towards the central Montana region, you can see that we do have some fairly strong lapse rates as well. We have lapse rates that are reaching the 7s and possibly the low 8s, maybe even the low 9s and further down south. However, with the weak dew points, we are definitely going to see much more moderate instability with the possibility of mostly in the 1000s to 2500 range. Then back towards the New England region, we have some fairly strong lapse rates. They are much more in the moderates range in the 7s and possibly the mid 8s, and with the possibility of some low 7s in some regions. With the dew points that are in place, we definitely see the possibility of Cape values that do reach the 2500 and maybe the low 3000s. Taking a look at our instability, starting with an enhanced risk region that is in Kansas and Nebraska in the Central Plains, you can see that we do have some fairly strong instability. Cape values that are reaching the mid to possibly the upper 3000s and maybe even the low 4000s along the storm boundaries. We could definitely see some pretty strong instability today, and with the possibility of elongated hodographs with the strong mid-level flow that is in this region in particular, we could definitely see the possibility of some very large hail that could develop, as well as the possibility of some destructive outflow gusts with extremely strong instability like this and strong lapse rates. And then back towards the Gulf Coast region, you can see that we do have some fairly strong Cape values that are reaching the mid to upper 3000s, possibly the low 4000s. That's definitely going to allow for the possibility of some pretty strong damaging outflow gusts. However, there isn't all that much of a hail threat. However, some isolated small hail could be possible with weak mid-level flow. And then back towards the central Montana threat, we could see that we do have much more moderate instability. You have Cape values that are mostly in the triple digits to the mid to upper 1000s range. And then back towards a slight risk that has that 2% tornado threat in Wisconsin and southern Minnesota, you can see that we do have some fairly strong Cape values that are reaching the 2500 range and also maybe even the low 3000s in some isolated regions. However, because of how small it is, it's likely just going to stay mostly in the 1000s to 2500 range and possibly the upper 2000s as well. And then taking a look at the Cape values back towards the New England region in that marginal threat, we do have some fairly overall much weaker instability than what we were expecting. We have Cape values that are reaching the 1000s range, possibly the triple digits, as well as the 2000s range as well. However, it is mostly going to stay in the 1000s to triple digits range, With Cape like this, we can see the possibility of some strong damaging outflow gusts and some gusty winds. Taking a look at our wind shear, I'm not too worried about our storm relative velocity outside of that 2% tornado threat area, and I will look at that after this wind shear. So taking a look at the enhanced risk region where we have that hatch significant region for large hail, we have some fairly strong wind shear in place. It is likely going to be mostly speed shear with a zonal flow in this region in particular. However, some speed shear in the 40 knots and 50 knots is definitely going to be sufficient enough for some elongated photographs and the possibility of some large hail. And then back towards the Montana threat where we had that 5% hail threat, we do have some fairly weak and more isolated wind shear. However, we do have wind shear that is definitely going to be sufficient enough for the possibility of that 5% hail threat with the instability that we're given. If we have stronger instability, we could definitely have a much stronger hail threat with elongated photographs. And then back towards the Wisconsin region where we also had a 15% hail threat, we are expected to have some elongated photographs with that trough here, and you can see that we do have some fairly strong speed shear as well, and some of that could be directional shear, but it is likely going to be mostly speed shear, and it's definitely going to allow for the possibility of some small to medium hail. Taking a look at our storm relative velocity, you can see where storms are initially going to develop. You can see that we do have around where storms are initially developed. You can see that storm line here. We do have some weak directional shear ahead of that. Could be usable by the storms when they initially develop. And then the main threat is going to come after directional shear develops over time with diurnal heating. You can see that storm line here, and then some weak directional shear ahead of that. That should be sufficient enough for that 2% tornado threat. Given the cape that we have. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. And if you live in any of the areas that I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being, and hopefully I will be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.